They said he wasn't ready, that he didn't have what it takes. A black pilot, daring to rise where few had before. But when the skies turned against him, when every decision became the difference between failure and survival, he proved them all wrong. And the man who doubted him the most? He was right there, watching. This isn't just a flight. This is a reckoning. Buckle up, because this story is about to take off. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air as the early morning sun crept through the sheer curtains of the modest suburban home in Atlanta, Georgia. Elijah Whitaker sat at the small wooden kitchen table, dressed in his neatly pressed Delta Airlines uniform. His fingers traced the rim of his coffee mug, but he had barely taken a sip. Instead, he sat still, staring at the calendar pinned to the wall, a date circled in bold red ink. Today marked the first step towards something bigger. His official application to the airline's captain training program. From the adjacent counter, his mother, Catherine Whitaker, quietly watched him as she finished preparing breakfast. The delicate clatter of a spoon against the ceramic bowl filled the silence between them. She had always been a woman of quiet strength, someone who chose her words carefully, especially when it came to matters involving her husband. "Elijah, you barely touched your food," she finally said, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. Her tone was soft, yet there was something in her voice that hinted at unease. He forced a small smile and pushed the plate slightly forward. "Not much of an appetite, I guess." Catherine wiped her hands on a dish towel and took a seat across from him. "Big day ahead?" He nodded, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, if I get into the program, it's a step closer to becoming a captain." Her lips pressed together in a thin line. "That's wonderful." But something in her expression didn't match her words. Before Elijah could respond, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by the unmistakable presence of Raymond Calloway. The former Air Force pilot carried an air of silent authority wherever he went, even in his own home. His graying hair was neatly combed back, but his sharp blue eyes held a permanent weight of disapproval, especially when they landed on Elijah. Raymond barely glanced at him before heading to the coffee maker. "Pilot training, huh?" he muttered as he poured himself a cup. Elijah tensed but kept his voice steady. "Captain training, actually." Raymond let out a short chuckle, low and dry, as he took a sip. "So they're just handing out promotions now? Didn't realize Delta was getting that desperate." A tight knot formed in Elijah's stomach, but he didn't react. This wasn't new. Catherine shifted in her seat. "Raymond, no, I'm just saying," he interrupted, turning to lean against the counter. "I spent years in the cockpit, and let me tell you something. Being a pilot is one thing, but leading a flight, making life and death decisions, that's a whole different ballgame. You think you're ready for that?" Elijah met his gaze, his voice calm but firm. "I know I am," Raymond scoffed. "Confidence is one thing, son. Experience is another." Elijah had heard enough. He pushed back his chair and stood, grabbing his jacket. Catherine reached for his hand. "Elijah, don't leave like this." He gave her fingers a small squeeze before letting go. "I have to get to work." As he walked past Raymond, the older man didn't move, didn't acknowledge him beyond a faint shake of his head. Stepping outside, Elijah inhaled deeply, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs. He had spent years enduring the quiet jabs, the unspoken belief that he wasn't enough. But today was different. Today he had something to prove. Not to Raymond, not even to Delta Airlines, but to himself. The hum of jet engines filled the air as Elijah stepped onto the tarmac of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The sky stretched wide above him, clear and crisp, a stark contrast to the weight he carried inside. He adjusted his uniform, the Delta Airlines insignia glinting under the morning sun, and strode toward the crew entrance. Inside the terminal, the familiar sights and sounds of travelers bustling through security and boarding gates surrounded him. It was routine by now, but today an extra layer of anticipation settled in his chest. He was meeting with the airline's training supervisors, an initial assessment before he could officially be considered for the captain program. "Elijah!" He turned at the sound of his name and saw Terrence Cole, his closest friend and fellow pilot, walking toward him with his usual easy stride. "You look like you're heading into battle," Terrence said, grinning as he adjusted the straps on his flight bag. "Feels like it." Elijah exhaled, shaking his head. Meeting with the supervisors this morning. First step toward captain training. Terrence let out a low whistle. Man, that's big. You ready? Elijah forced a smirk. Of course. Totally calm. No nerves whatsoever. Terrence chuckled. Right. And I'm the President of the United States. They made their way through the employee-only corridors, passing framed photographs of past captains. Portraits of seasoned men, mostly white, their faces etched with decades of experience. It wasn't lost on Elijah how few people who looked like him had made it to that level. As they approached the briefing room, Terrence clapped a hand on Elijah's shoulder. Listen, you got this. Don't let them get in your head. Elijah nodded, appreciating the support. But as he stepped inside the room, his confidence was immediately tested. A long conference table stretched before him, where 3 senior pilots and training supervisors sat, their expressions unreadable. Among them was Captain David Hensley, a veteran pilot with a reputation for being ruthless in his assessments. Elijah Whitaker, Hensley said, flipping through a folder. First officer with 3 years of experience at Delta, solid performance record, but you're applying for the captain training program ahead of schedule. Yes, sir, Elijah replied, keeping his posture straight. One of the other men, Captain Richardson, raised an eyebrow. What makes you think you're ready? Elijah had prepared for this. I've logged over 3,000 flight hours, including challenging weather conditions and emergency drills. I've studied under some of the best, and I know I have the leadership and decision-making skills necessary to command a flight. Hensley leaned back, arms crossed. That's all well and good, but experience isn't just about flight hours. It's about judgment. We've seen pilots with twice your time in the air crack under pressure. Richardson added, and let's be honest, there aren't a lot of captains who look like you in this industry. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Elijah kept his expression neutral, but he felt the familiar frustration simmer beneath the surface. With all due respect, he said evenly, that's exactly why I need to be here. If you don't give people like me the chance to prove ourselves, nothing changes. A brief silence followed. Hensley studied him for a moment before closing the folder in front of him. All right, Whitaker, we'll put you through the first phase. Flight simulations, stress tests, leadership assessments. You either prove yourself or you don't. Elijah gave a firm nod. Understood, Captain. As he exited the room, Terrence was waiting just outside. How'd it go? They're going to test me, Elijah said. Terrence smirked. Of course they are, but that's what you do best, right? Elijah exhaled, letting the tension roll off his shoulders. This was just the beginning. The training center was quieter than the main terminal. No rushing passengers, no last-minute gate changes, just the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the low murmur of instructors briefing pilots in nearby rooms. Elijah sat in a row of chairs with 3 other candidates, all waiting for their first assessment, the flight simulation test. A door swung open, and Captain David Hensley stepped out, clipboard in hand. His gaze swept over the group before settling on Elijah. Whitaker, you're up. Elijah rose, adjusted his uniform, and followed Hensley down the hall toward the simulator bay. The large metal chamber before him mimicked the cockpit of a Boeing 737, every dial, screen, and switch designed to replicate real-life conditions. It was the closest thing to being in the air without actually leaving the ground. Hensley gestured toward the seat. Your scenario: a standard flight from Atlanta to Miami. Midway through, you'll encounter unexpected turbulence. Your job is to manage it, keep the aircraft stable, and communicate with your crew. Understood? Elijah nodded. Yes, sir. He took his place in the left seat, the captain's seat. The simulation began with the usual pre-flight procedures, co-pilot and air traffic control interactions, unfolding as they would in a real flight. Everything was smooth at first, routine. But then the turbulence hit. The simulator jolted violently. Warning lights flashed. The sound of wind howling through the speakers added to the realism. Elijah gripped the controls, keeping his voice steady, reducing speed, adjusting altitude to stabilize. The aircraft bucked as he fought against the simulated storm, every instinct screaming at him to overcorrect. But he didn't. He breathed through it, kept his movements controlled. Hensley watched, expression unreadable. Finally, the turbulence eased and the cockpit steadied. Elijah exhaled slowly. All right, Hensley said, jotting something down. You kept the plane steady, didn't panic. but you hesitated for a second when the first warning light flashed. Elijah stiffened. I was evaluating my options. Hensley met his gaze. In a real emergency, that second of hesitation can be the difference between life and death. The words stung, but Elijah nodded. Understood. Hensley closed the clipboard. We'll see how you handle the next test. As Elijah stepped out of the simulator bay, Terrence was waiting for him. How'd it go? They're pushing me hard, Elijah muttered. Terrence smirked. That's because they know you're worth pushing. Elijah wasn't sure if that was true, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The next phase of training came sooner than expected. Elijah barely had time to process his performance in the simulator before he was called in for his next test, decision-making under stress. The briefing room felt colder than usual, the air thick with silent judgment. Seated across from him were Captain Hensley, Captain Richardson, and a third evaluator, Captain Mendez. The three men studied him as if weighing something invisible, something beyond his ability to fly a plane. Hensley finally spoke. Today's assessment isn't about flying, it's about leadership. Let's see if you can handle the pressure. A screen behind them flickered to life, showing a mock flight log from a Delta Airlines flight en route from New York to Dallas. The scenario was simple, until it wasn't. Richardson leaned forward. You're the captain. An hour into the flight, your co-pilot starts showing signs of disorientation. His responses are slow, his hands are shaking. You're over the Appalachian Mountains with no major airports nearby. What do you do? Elijah's mind clicked into action. First, I'd check his vitals, see if he's responding to basic commands. If he's unable to function, I'd assume control and declare a medical emergency to ATC. Mendez raised an eyebrow. You're assuming it's medical. What if it's fatigue, hypoxia? What if it's something worse? Elijah kept his voice steady. I'd check the cabin pressure readings to rule out hypoxia. If that's not the issue, I'd request priority landing at the nearest viable airport while keeping my crew informed. We don't take chances with a compromised pilot. Hensley gave nothing away, just tapped his pen against the desk. And what if ATC denies your request to land early? The airline doesn't want to disrupt schedules. Elijah didn't hesitate. I override. Safety comes first. No flight schedule is worth risking lives. Silence. Then Richardson closed the folder in front of him. All right, Whitaker, that's enough for now. Elijah stood, his pulse steady despite the tension in the room. As he stepped out, he ran into Terrence, who had just finished his own evaluation. How was it? Terrence asked. Elijah exhaled. Felt like they were trying to trap me. Terrence smirked. That means you're getting under their skin. If they didn't think you had potential, they wouldn't push this hard. Elijah considered that as he glanced back toward the room. Inside, Hensley and the other captains exchanged looks. Mendez finally said, He's good. Hensley nodded. Yeah, but let's see how he handles the next test. Elijah barely had time to catch his breath before the next phase of his training was thrown at him. This time, it wasn't a simulation. He was about to step into a real cockpit with a real plane and real passengers. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was buzzing with activity as usual, but for Elijah, today felt different. He adjusted his uniform as he walked toward the Delta Airlines operations office, his mind already focused on the task ahead. Today, he would serve as a temporary captain on a supervised flight, a true test of whether he could handle the role he had been fighting for. Inside the operations office, Captain Hensley was waiting with a stack of flight details. He didn't waste time on small talk. You're flying Flight 289 to Denver today. 2-hour trip, routine weather, but don't let that fool you. Even the smoothest flights can test a captain's leadership. Elijah nodded. Understood. And Whitaker, Hensley's gaze was sharp. Don't just focus on flying the plane. A captain is more than a pilot. He's the person the entire crew and every passenger depend on. Elijah met his gaze with quiet determination. Yes, sir. As he walked toward the boarding gate, he spotted Terrence waiting for him, a lopsided grin on his face. They're actually letting you run the show today? Elijah smirked. That's the plan? Terrence clapped him on the back. Then make it count. The flight begins. Elijah settled into the captain's seat of the Boeing 737, a place that once felt unreachable. Next to him was First Officer Mark Reynolds, a seasoned pilot with a no-nonsense demeanor. "Captain for the day, huh?" Reynolds said, adjusting his headset. "Let's see what you've got." Elijah didn't rise to the bait. "Pre-flight checks?" Reynolds nodded, and they ran through the checklist smoothly. Soon they were taxiing onto the runway. The engines roared to life, and as Elijah guided the plane into the sky, a sense of calm settled over him. Everything was smooth at first. Clear skies, light air traffic, a perfect day to fly, until it wasn't. The unexpected challenge. 30 minutes into the flight, a sudden turbulence warning flashed on the screen. Elijah frowned, checking the weather radar. Reynolds noticed. "Problem? Unexpected turbulence ahead. The system's flagging stronger wind shear than we were briefed on." The plane shuddered slightly, and the seatbelt sign flashed on automatically. Elijah grabbed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're encountering some mild turbulence, so please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The crew moved swiftly, ensuring passengers were secure. The turbulence intensified, small jolts turning into sharper drops. Elijah kept his grip firm on the controls, counteracting the movement. Then a warning alarm blared. A critical decision. Elijah's eyes darted to the instrument panel. A pressure differential warning. Reynolds stiffened. Cabin pressures fluctuating. Could be a sensor glitch or a real problem. Elijah didn't hesitate. He had trained for this. "Releasing oxygen mass," he said, flipping the emergency switch. "Descending to a safer altitude." Reynolds glanced at him. "You sure?" "We don't have confirmation it's a real depressurization. We're not waiting to find out." He called air traffic control, requesting a lower altitude to stabilize the cabin pressure. The plane descended smoothly, and after a few minutes, the warning light shut off. The turbulence eased. The cabin pressure stabilized, and the passengers, most of whom had no idea what had just happened, continued their flight without issue. A captain's judgment. As they approached Denver, Reynolds finally spoke. "That was a solid call. Some pilots would have waited too long for confirmation." Elijah exhaled, the weight of the last hour settling in. A second too long, and it could have turned into a real emergency. They landed without further issue, and as Elijah stepped off the plane, Captain Hensley was waiting at the gate. "I heard about the turbulence," Hensley said, arms crossed. "Heard you handled it well." Elijah shrugged. "Just doing my job." Hensley gave a slow nod. "We'll see if you can keep doing it." Elijah knew this was only the beginning. The Denver airport bustled with its usual rhythm, pilots walking briskly between gates, passengers dragging their carry-ons, flight attendants chatting near boarding desks. But for Elijah, everything outside the terminal felt muted. His mind was still in the cockpit, replaying every second of the flight, every decision, every moment of tension. He had handled it well. He knew that. But something about the way Captain Hensley had looked at him before walking away left a lingering sense of unease. "Elijah." He turned to see First Officer Mark Reynolds approaching, his expression unreadable. "Good work up there," Reynolds said. "Not every pilot would have made that call." Elijah studied him for a second. He had expected skepticism, maybe even criticism. Instead, there was a sliver of something else. Respect. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his mother, Catherine. "Call me when you land. It's about Raymond." A cold knot formed in his stomach. A familiar battle. The flight back to Atlanta felt longer than usual. By the time Elijah pulled into his mother's driveway later that evening, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only the amber glow of streetlights. He barely had time to step inside before Catherine's concerned eyes met his. "Mom, what happened?" She hesitated. "Raymond knows about your flight today. He heard about the turbulence. He had some things to say." Elijah exhaled sharply, already anticipating the worst. "What did he say this time?" She wrung her hands. "He doesn't believe you handled it right. He said you panicked." Elijah let out a bitter laugh, cutting her off. "Of course he did." Catherine reached for his arm. "Sweetheart, he's never going to admit he was wrong, but that doesn't mean you have to keep letting him get to you." Elijah clenched his jaw. "I don't care what he thinks." The lie sat heavy in the air between them. The confrontation. An hour later, Elijah found himself standing at Raymond Calloway's front door. He hadn't planned to come here, but something inside him, something unresolved, had dragged him here anyway. Raymond opened the door with a scowl, as if he had been expecting him. "What do you want?" Elijah stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "You really couldn't wait to throw your opinion at Mom, could you?" Raymond shut the door behind him, arms crossed. "I heard about your flight. Thought you'd be smarter than to overreact to a pressure warning." Elijah felt the anger bubble up. "Overreact? I followed protocol. I made a judgment call that kept that plane safe." Raymond scoffed. "A real captain knows the difference between a real emergency and a false alarm. You just proved you don't." Elijah's fist tightened. "And what exactly do you know about being a real captain, Raymond?" The room went silent. Raymond's gaze darkened. "Watch your tone." Elijah took a step closer. "You don't get to sit here and act like you know better than me. You lost your wings, remember? You weren't good enough to keep them." The words hit their mark. For the first time, Raymond's mask cracked. His fingers curled at his sides, his jaw twitched. But instead of anger, there was something else in his eyes, something closer to shame. For a split second, Elijah almost felt guilty. Almost. Raymond straightened, forcing his voice back to cold indifference. "Enjoy your little promotion while it lasts." Elijah shook his head, exhaling sharply. "You know what? I used to want your approval. I spent years trying to prove to you that I was good enough." He turned toward the door, pausing only once. "But I don't need it anymore." And with that, he left Raymond standing alone in the dimly lit hallway. A change in perspective. By the time Elijah got back to his apartment, exhaustion weighed heavy on his bones. But something else was there too. Clarity. For years, he had let Raymond's voice dictate how he saw himself. Let the man's bitterness seep into his own self-doubt. But now he saw it for what it really was. Raymond wasn't disappointed in him. Raymond was afraid that Elijah had become the pilot he never could be. Elijah let out a slow breath and sank onto his couch. For the first time in a long time, he felt lighter. The early morning air was crisp as Elijah pulled into the Delta Airlines training center. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the tarmac. Today was different. Today he was flying a test flight with senior evaluators on board, a final step before officially entering the captain program. He took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders as he stepped into the crew lounge. His uniform was pristine, his posture straight, but inside his mind buzzed with 1,000 thoughts. The confrontation with Raymond still lingered, but he pushed it aside. This was bigger than Raymond, bigger than proving anything to him. "Whitaker," a voice called. Elijah turned to see Captain David Hensley standing near the scheduling board, arms crossed. "You ready for today?" Hensley asked, his tone unreadable. Elijah met his gaze. "Always." Hensley studied him for a moment before nodding toward the briefing room. "Then let's see if that confidence holds up in the air." A stacked deck. Inside the briefing room, Elijah took his seat across from 3 evaluators, Hensley, Captain Richardson, and Captain Mendez. The tension was palpable. Richardson glanced at his notes. "You're scheduled to command a round-trip flight from Atlanta to Chicago today. We'll be monitoring everything, your leadership, your decision-making, your ability to handle crew and passengers." Mendez added, "And let's be clear, this isn't just about flying. A captain has to inspire confidence in everyone on board." Elijah nodded, unfazed. "Understood." Hensley leaned forward slightly. "And one more thing. You'll be flying with a crew you've never worked with before. We want to see how you adapt." Elijah felt a flicker of something beneath his ribs. A test within a test. He simply nodded. "Let's get to it, then." Into the captain's seat. Standing in the jet bridge, Elijah met his crew for the first time. First Officer Brian Lewis, a pilot in his mid-40s with a skeptical expression. It was clear from the first handshake that he wasn't thrilled about taking orders from Elijah. Lead flight attendant Carol Simmons, a veteran in the industry, polite but guarded. The rest of the crew seemed neutral, but Elijah could feel it, the unspoken weight of their expectations. As they boarded the plane, Brian Lewis fell into step beside him. "So, captain for a day, huh?" he muttered just loud enough for Elijah to hear. Elijah glanced at him, keeping his tone even. That a problem? Lewis smirked. Guess we'll find out. Elijah took his place in the captain's seat. The cockpit was his domain, and no amount of doubt from Lewis or anyone else would shake that. An uneasy takeoff. As they taxied onto the runway, Elijah's voice came over the intercom. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Whitaker speaking. We'll be departing shortly for Chicago with an estimated flight time of 2 hours. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight? Lewis didn't bother hiding his smirk. Sounded good. Almost like you've done this before? Elijah ignored him. Pre-flight checks? They ran through the checklist, but Lewis's tone was clipped, his responses deliberately slow, almost as if he was testing Elijah's patience. Elijah didn't bite. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to lead. A mid-air challenge. The first half of the flight was uneventful, but just as they approached their cruising altitude, a call came through from the flight attendants. A passenger was experiencing severe chest pains. Elijah immediately grabbed the intercom. This is Captain Whitaker. Do we have any medical personnel on board? Carol Simmons responded. A doctor is assisting, but the passenger's condition is worsening. Elijah turned to Lewis. Check the nearest airports. We may need to divert. Lewis hesitated. Chicago's not far. We could push through. Elijah's jaw tightened. That's not an option. If this turns serious, we need to be on the ground now. After a tense beat, Lewis sighed. Fine. Closest option is Nashville. Elijah radioed air traffic control, requesting immediate priority landing at Nashville International. Medical emergency on board. Permission was granted, and within minutes, Elijah expertly guided the plane into a smooth descent. As soon as they landed, paramedics were waiting at the gate. The sick passenger was rushed off the plane, and within moments, the crisis was over. A shift in perspective. As they taxied back to the runway, Lewis let out a small breath. That was a good call. Elijah turned to him. What, you thought I'd risk a passenger's life to stay on schedule? Lewis didn't respond right away. Then after a long pause, he muttered, You did good, Captain. For the first time all day, Elijah saw something in his expression other than doubt. Respect. As they took off again, Elijah allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Maybe, just maybe, he had proven something today. The descent into Chicago was smooth, the skyline stretching across the horizon as the sun cast long shadows over the city. Elijah kept his focus sharp, guiding the aircraft toward the runway with precision. In the seat beside him, First Officer Brian Lewis had been noticeably quieter since the emergency landing in Nashville. The skepticism in his eyes had softened, slightly, but Elijah knew better than to expect a complete shift overnight. Respect was earned, not given. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, Elijah felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He had made the right call, but would the evaluator see it that way? Over the intercom, he made his final announcement. Welcome to Chicago, folks. We appreciate you flying with us today. On behalf of myself and the crew, we hope to see you again soon. After shutting down the systems, Elijah turned to Lewis. Good work today. Lewis hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, you too. It wasn't much, but it was something. The waiting game. Stepping off the jet bridge, Elijah was met by Captain Hensley, Captain Richardson, and Captain Mendez, the three men who would decide whether today's flight had been a success or a failure. Hensley's expression was unreadable as he spoke. Let's walk. Elijah followed them into a private briefing room. The door shut behind him, the air thick with unspoken judgment. Richardson leaned against the table, arms crossed. You made the call to divert to Nashville. Elijah met his gaze. Yes, sir. Mendez tapped his fingers against his notepad. It was the right move, but it wasn't a perfect one. You could have coordinated with the medical personnel on board earlier. Maybe gathered more information before making the call. Elijah kept his voice level. I acted based on the symptoms reported and the potential risks. Any delay could have been fatal. Richardson nodded slightly, but his face remained impassive. Hensley finally spoke. You handled the turbulence last week. You handled today's emergency. But what happens when the next challenge isn't as straightforward? When there isn't a clear right answer? Elijah didn't hesitate. I trust my training. I trust my instincts. A long silence followed. Then Hensley nodded. We'll review everything and let you know. A call from home hours later, back in his hotel room, Elijah sat on the edge of the bed staring at his phone. The flight had gone well. He knew it. But the doubt lingered. Then his phone buzzed. His mother. Elijah, Catherine's voice was warm but tinged with concern. I just wanted to check in. How was your flight? He exhaled, rubbing his temples. It went fine. Emergency landing in Nashville, but everything was handled. A pause, then, softly. Raymond heard about it. Elijah's stomach tightened. And? Catherine hesitated. He said, a real captain would have pushed through. Elijah let out a bitter laugh. Of course he did. Elijah, don't let him get in your head. Too late. As he hung up, Elijah stared at his reflection in the window, the city lights flickering outside. For years, Raymond's voice had been the one thing he couldn't silence. Maybe it was time to finally prove, to himself, that he didn't need to. The crisp morning air of Chicago wrapped around Elijah as he stepped onto the tarmac. The hum of jet engines filling the space around him. His uniform was as sharp as ever. But today, there was something heavier weighing on him. The waiting. The official decision from Delta's training committee still hadn't come through. Had he done enough? Had they seen what he was capable of? He pushed those thoughts aside as he made his way through the terminal, the familiar sights of passengers rushing between gates barely registering. He had a flight to get back to Atlanta, one more trip before everything changed. A familiar face in an unexpected place. As he entered the pilot lounge, Elijah stopped short. Brian Lewis was already inside, nursing a coffee. The first officer glanced up, then smirked. Whitaker, Elijah nodded, grabbing a coffee of his own. Lewis. There was an awkward pause, but then Lewis leaned back, studying Elijah. You ever wonder if all this is worth it? Elijah raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Lewis exhaled slowly. The pressure, the constant testing, the way they make you jump through hoops just to see if you'll crack. Elijah shrugged. If it was easy, everyone would do it. Lewis chuckled. Yeah, well, some people get tested harder than others. The words hung between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of what Elijah had been up against his entire career. Then, as if realizing he had said too much, Lewis cleared his throat and stood. Anyway, safe flight back. Elijah watched him go, something shifting in his chest. Maybe he wasn't the only one who had been fighting for respect. An unexpected announcement. Just as Elijah was about to leave, his phone buzzed. A message from Captain Hensley. Report to my office before departure. We have a decision. Elijah's heartbeat quickened. This was it. The moment of truth. Hensley's office was exactly as Elijah had expected. Neat, minimal, no unnecessary distractions. The senior captain sat behind his desk, flipping through a file as Elijah stood at attention. Hensley finally looked up. Take a seat, Whitaker. Elijah did, keeping his posture straight. Hensley set the file down. Your performance has been reviewed. Your response to turbulence, your decision-making in the medical emergency, your ability to handle crew dynamics, all of it. Elijah braced himself. A pause, then, you're in. Elijah blinked. What? Hensley smirked. You heard me. Welcome to the captain training program. For a moment, Elijah couldn't speak. All the years of doubt, of pushing past expectations, of hearing Raymond's voice telling him he wasn't enough. It all led to this. He finally exhaled. Thank you, Captain. Hensley stood, extending a hand. Don't thank me yet. The real work starts now. Elijah shook his hand, a rare smile tugging at his lips. For the first time, he wasn't just trying to prove something. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Elijah stood in the Delta Airlines training center, staring at his reflection in the glass window overlooking the runway. Captain in training. The title felt surreal, heavier than he'd imagined. For years he had fought for this moment. The late-night studying, the grueling evaluations, the constant battle against doubt, against Raymond, against the system, against himself. Now that he had made it, he thought he'd feel victorious. Instead, all he felt was pressure. The captain training program wasn't just about flying, It was about command. Every decision he made now would be judged not just by instructors, but by the pilots and crew who looked to him for leadership. The weight of responsibility was real. His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Elijah Whitaker," Terrence Cole called from across the lounge, grinning as he approached. "They really let you in, huh?" Elijah smirked. "Seems like it." Terrence clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Damn right they did. You earned this." Elijah exhaled. "Feels like I just got past one test, only to step into a bigger one." Terrence raised an eyebrow. "That's because you did. The captain title isn't just about flying, it's about every call you make. It's about how you handle the worst situations, how you keep people calm when everything is falling apart." Elijah nodded. He knew Terrence was right. "First official training flight is tomorrow," Elijah said. "They're putting me with a new crew, just to see how I handle things." Terrence smirked. "Guess we'll see if you've got what it takes, huh?" Elijah let out a dry chuckle. That's what it always came down to, didn't it? Proving himself. Again and again. The call that changed everything. That night, Elijah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind restless. Just as he was about to close his eyes, his phone rang. Catherine. He sat up immediately. "Mom?" Her voice was quiet, hesitant. "Elijah, it's Raymond." His stomach twisted. "What about him?" "He collapsed earlier. He's in the hospital." Elijah felt a strange mix of emotions. Concern, resentment, confusion. "Is he okay?" he asked, his voice more distant than he intended. "He's stable," Catherine said. "But he asked for you." Silence. Elijah closed his eyes, exhaling. After everything, after all the years of being told he wasn't good enough, now Raymond wanted to see him? Catherine spoke again, softly. "You don't have to go, but I thought you should know." Elijah sat there for a long time, gripping his phone. He had a flight tomorrow, a chance to prove himself once again. But for the first time, he wasn't sure what the right decision was. The next morning, Elijah sat in his car outside the hospital parking lot, staring at the entrance. He hadn't planned to come, not really. He had told himself last night that he wouldn't, that Raymond had made his choices, and so had he. But something about hearing his mother's voice on the phone, the hesitation in the way she had said, "He asked for you," had stayed with him. So here he was. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before finally stepping out of the car. The automatic doors slid open, and the familiar sterility of a hospital greeted him. The faint scent of disinfectant, the quiet hum of machines, the distant murmur of nurses at their station. At the front desk, he hesitated for only a second before asking, "Raymond Calloway?" The nurse glanced up, typing quickly into her system. "Room 317, down the hall to your left." He nodded in thanks but didn't move right away. Once he walked down that hallway, there would be no turning back. A man at his weakest. When Elijah finally stepped into the hospital room, he was struck by how small Raymond looked. The man who had towered over him his whole life, who had filled every room with his presence, now lay in a hospital bed, his skin pale, his breathing slow. The beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence. Raymond's head turned slightly at the sound of footsteps. His eyes, still sharp despite the exhaustion, settled on Elijah. "You came," he rasped. Elijah didn't respond right away. He took slow, deliberate steps forward, stopping at the foot of the bed. "Mom said you asked for me." Raymond swallowed, nodding slightly. He looked uncomfortable, as if he had rehearsed this moment in his head a dozen times, but now, faced with it, wasn't sure what to say. "I heard about your training," Raymond finally said, voice rough. "That you made it." Elijah's hands clenched at his sides. So that's what this was? Another test? Another chance for Raymond to weigh him and find him lacking? "Yeah," Elijah said, keeping his tone flat. "I did." Raymond nodded slowly, as if processing something. "I always knew you had potential." Elijah barked out a laugh before he could stop himself. "Is that what you call it? Because from where I stood, you spent years telling me the exact opposite." Raymond's eyes darkened. "I never said you weren't good." Elijah's anger flared. "No? Then what the hell do you call every time you tore me down? Every time you told me I wasn't ready? Every time you made sure I knew I'd never be as good as you." Silence. For the first time, Raymond looked away. Elijah exhaled sharply, running a hand over his jaw. He hadn't come here for a fight, but the wounds were still there, still fresh, no matter how much time had passed. Raymond finally spoke, voice lower. "I wasn't trying to break you." Elijah scoffed. "Sure as hell felt like it." Raymond's fingers curled weakly against the blanket. "I pushed you because I knew what was waiting for you out there. You think I didn't see how they looked at you? How they doubted you before you even stepped foot in the cockpit?" Elijah's breath caught in his chest. Raymond continued, each word slower, more deliberate. "I wanted you to be better. So good that no one could ever question why you were there." Elijah stared at him, something inside him twisting. He had spent his whole life thinking Raymond had tried to keep him down. But what if it had been the opposite? What if in his own twisted, cruel way, Raymond had been trying to prepare him? Not an excuse, not even close, but an answer. And Elijah wasn't sure how he felt about that. A decision to make. "I didn't need you to be my drill instructor," Elijah said, his voice quieter now. "I needed you to be my father." Raymond swallowed hard, nodding slightly. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Elijah turned toward the door. "I have a flight to catch." Raymond didn't stop him, didn't ask for anything more. As Elijah stepped out into the hallway, the weight on his chest felt different. Not gone, but shifted. Some things couldn't be fixed. But maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to stay broken either. Elijah sat in the captain's seat of a Boeing 737, his hands steady on the controls, his mind focused on the checklist before him. The engines rumbled softly as the aircraft idled at the gate of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Today wasn't a routine flight. It was his first official training flight as a captain in training, and seated next to him was Captain David Hensley, evaluating his every move. Hensley adjusted his headset. "You ready for this, Whitaker?" Elijah met his gaze with quiet confidence. "Always." Hensley smirked. "We'll see about that." A crew to command. The cockpit door opened, and First Officer Amanda Grayson stepped inside. She was a sharp-eyed pilot in her late 30s, someone with experience, but also a reputation for being unforgiving with new captains. She slid into her seat, glancing at Elijah. "So, you're the new guy." Elijah nodded. "Looks that way." Grayson studied him for a moment. "Let's see if you can keep up." Elijah simply smiled. He had spent years proving himself. Today wouldn't be any different. Behind them, the flight attendants completed their final checks. The lead flight attendant, Lisa Martinez, tapped on the cockpit door. "Cabin secure, Captain." It was the first time anyone had called him that in an official setting. "Captain." Elijah acknowledged her with a nod. "Thank you, Lisa. Let's get this flight in the air." A challenge from the start. As the plane taxied onto the runway, air traffic control crackled through the headset. "Delta 542, you are cleared for takeoff. Wind at 15 knots, slight crosswind." Elijah tightened his grip on the controls. A crosswind takeoff. Not the worst challenge, but definitely not ideal for a first flight. Hensley sat back watching. "Show me what you got, Whitaker." Elijah eased the throttles forward. The aircraft roared to life, speeding down the runway. The crosswind pushed against the fuselage, but Elijah compensated smoothly, keeping the nose steady. At rotation speed, he pulled back on the yoke, lifting the aircraft into the sky. Smooth, controlled, professional. Grayson glanced at him as they climbed. Not bad. Hensley didn't say a word, just made a note on his clipboard. A test of leadership. 40 minutes into the flight, cruising at 35,000 feet, a call came through from the cabin. Lisa's voice was tense. "Captain, we have a passenger in distress. Unresponsive." Elijah's mind switched gears immediately. He turned to Grayson. "Take controls." She nodded, seamlessly stepping into the role. Elijah grabbed the intercom. "Lisa, do we have any medical personnel on board?" "Yes, a nurse is assisting, but the passenger's pulse is weak." Elijah scanned the flight log. The nearest airport was Charlotte, North Carolina, about 20 minutes away. He turned to Hensley. We need to divert. Hensley didn't react, just studied him. Your call, Captain. Elijah didn't hesitate. He radioed air traffic control, requesting an immediate diversion to Charlotte. As the plane turned toward its new destination, Lisa's voice came through again. Captain, the passenger is fading fast. Elijah's jaw tightened. Every second mattered. The clock is ticking. The descent into Charlotte was intense. Elijah could feel the weight of every life on board pressing down on him. As they neared the runway, emergency vehicles were already in position, flashing red and blue lights illuminating the tarmac. With one final adjustment, Elijah brought the plane down for a smooth landing. The moment they stopped, paramedics rushed on board. The passenger was taken off swiftly, the flight attendants working seamlessly to assist. In the cockpit, Elijah finally exhaled. Grayson looked at him, a hint of newfound respect in her eyes. Nice job, Captain. Even Hensley, ever the critic, gave a small nod. You made the right call. We'll debrief after refueling. Elijah leaned back in his seat, his pulse still steady. He had been tested. He had passed. But he knew this was just the beginning. The airport terminal in Charlotte, North Carolina, hummed with movement as passengers stretched their legs, waiting for clearance to continue their journey. From the cockpit, Elijah observed the organized chaos outside. Refueling trucks, ground crew preparing the plane for takeoff, paramedics loading the stretcher into an ambulance. The passenger had survived, at least for now. But inside the cockpit, the real evaluation was still happening. Captain David Hensley flipped through his notes, expression unreadable. First Officer Amanda Grayson sat beside Elijah, arms crossed, her sharp eyes fixed on him. You made the right call, Grayson finally said. I would have done the same. Elijah exhaled slowly. Thanks. But, she continued, leaning back, you should have gotten more information before deciding to divert. A few extra questions to the cabin crew could have given you a better picture of the situation. Elijah tensed. The nurse on board said his pulse was weak. What if I had waited too long? Grayson shrugged. That's the game, Captain. Sometimes waiting helps. Sometimes it kills people. Silence stretched between them. Hensley tapped his pen against the clipboard. Grayson's right. You need to gather all available data before committing. That said, he closed his folder. You made the right decision today, and that's what matters. Elijah nodded, absorbing their words. This wasn't just about making quick decisions. It was about making the right ones with the best information available. The call from home. As the crew prepared for departure, Elijah stepped into the jet bridge to check his phone. A missed call. Catherine. His stomach tightened. He hit redial, pacing as the line rang. His mother answered almost immediately. Elijah. He could tell from her voice. Something was wrong. It's Raymond. His grip on the phone tightened. What happened? He checked himself out of the hospital. Elijah stopped pacing. What? I told him to stay. The doctors told him to stay. But you know how he is. He just left. A mix of frustration and worry flared in his chest. Why did Raymond always have to be like this? Did he say where he was going? Catherine hesitated. But I think it had something to do with you. Elijah clenched his jaw. Raymond had spent years tearing him down. And now when Elijah finally didn't need his approval, he was making himself part of the story again. Elijah, Catherine's voice softened, just don't shut him out completely. Whatever he's doing, I think it's important. Elijah closed his eyes. He didn't have time for this. Not now. I have to go, Mom. We're about to take off. A pause, then quietly. All right, just be careful. Back in the captain's seat. By the time he re-entered the cockpit, his mind was racing, but he pushed everything aside. Whatever was happening with Raymond could wait. Right now, his focus was on the passengers, the flight, and proving once again that he belonged in this seat. He adjusted his headset. Let's get everyone home. Grayson smirked slightly. Now you're sounding like a captain. Elijah gave a small nod, because for the first time, he truly felt like one. The engines hummed steadily as Flight 542 soared through the evening sky, leaving Charlotte behind. The sunset cast a golden glow over the horizon, stretching endless across the clouds. Inside the cockpit, everything was calm, at least on the surface. Elijah sat in the captain's seat, hands steady on the controls. But his mind was anything but. Raymond had left the hospital. No explanation, no reason. Just walked out. And now, for the first time in his life, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with him. He forced himself to focus on the flight. A captain's job wasn't just to fly, it was to lead. And he had passengers in the back who expected him to get them home safely. Beside him, First Officer Amanda Grayson glanced over. "You good, Captain?" Elijah snapped back to the present. "Yeah, just thinking." Grayson smirked. "Thinking is good, but not when you're at 35,000 feet. He let out a short breath, forcing a smirk in return. She wasn't wrong. An unwelcome visitor. 20 minutes into the flight, the cockpit phone buzzed. A call from the lead flight attendant, Lisa Martinez. Elijah answered. "Go ahead." Lisa's voice was careful. "Captain, we have a passenger in first class who's insisting on speaking with you." Elijah frowned. That was unusual. "What's the issue?" Lisa hesitated. "He won't say, but he's persistent." Elijah's gut tightened. "Who is he?" A beat, then, "Raymond Calloway." Elijah froze. The sound of the engine suddenly seemed distant, everything else fading into the background. Raymond was on his flight. "Elijah?" Lisa's voice cut through. He forced himself to speak. "I'll be right there." Face to face, one more time. Elijah stepped into the first-class cabin, his pulse steady but his mind racing. What the hell was Raymond doing here? And then, there he was. Raymond sat near the window, looking oddly out of place in his worn-out leather jacket among business travelers in crisp suits. His eyes met Elijah's, sharp and unreadable. "You've got to be kidding me," Elijah muttered under his breath. Raymond smirked. "Hell of a flight, huh?" Elijah crossed his arms. "What are you doing here?" Raymond leaned back slightly. "Taking a trip." Elijah exhaled through his nose. The man never gave a straight answer. "You left the hospital." Raymond shrugged. "Didn't feel like staying." Elijah stared at him. "You just happened to book a seat on my flight?" Raymond's smirk faltered slightly, but he didn't look away. "Elijah," he said after a moment, his voice quieter, "I needed to see it for myself." Elijah frowned. "See what?" Raymond gestured toward the cockpit. "You, up there, flying this thing, in charge." Elijah's breath caught in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "You spent years telling me I'd never make it," Elijah said, his voice steady but low. "Now you want a front-row seat to watch me prove you wrong?" Raymond's gaze was unreadable, something flickering behind his eyes, something Elijah had never seen before. "I was wrong," Raymond said simply. Silence stretched between them. Elijah didn't know what to do with those words. He had spent his whole life preparing to hear them, but now that they were here, they felt hollow. "You didn't have to be on my flight to say that," Elijah said finally. Raymond let out a dry chuckle. "Maybe not, but I figured if I was going to see my stepson as a captain, I might as well be a passenger on his plane." Elijah swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what to do with that either. A voice crackled through the PA system. "Captain Whitaker, please return to the cockpit." Elijah nodded once. "Sit tight. We'll be landing soon." Raymond just smirked. "That's your job, ain't it?" Elijah turned, walking back toward the cockpit. His heart was still steady, but his mind was anywhere but calm. Elijah walked back into the cockpit, his jaw tight, his mind still replaying the conversation with Raymond. He had spent years waiting to hear those words, "I was wrong." But now that he had, they didn't feel like victory. They felt like something unfinished. Beside him, First Officer Amanda Grayson glanced over. "Everything good back there?" Elijah settled into his seat, adjusting his headset. "Yeah." She arched an eyebrow. "You sure? You look like you just saw a ghost." Elijah smirked slightly. "Something like that." Grayson didn't push. Instead, she turned back to the flight controls. "We've been cleared for descent. ATC says we've got a little crosswind on approach, but nothing we can't handle." Elijah exhaled, pushing everything else aside. "Focus. All right, let's bring her down." A captain's landing. As they began their descent into Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the city lights stretched wide beneath them. The crosswinds made the approach slightly unstable, but Elijah kept his hands steady. Grayson monitored the instruments. Winds at 18 knots now, coming from the west. Elijah adjusted his heading slightly, feeling the resistance in the controls. The plane dipped slightly, not dangerous, but noticeable. Hensley's voice echoed in his mind. A captain isn't just a pilot. A captain is who everyone trusts to get them home. He made a small correction to the approach angle, keeping the descent smooth. The plane glided in, and at the perfect moment, the wheels kissed the runway. Smooth, confident. Grayson gave a small nod. Nice landing, Captain. Elijah allowed himself the smallest smile. He wasn't just flying anymore. He was leading. An unfinished conversation. After the passengers disembarked, Elijah stepped out into the terminal, half expecting Raymond to have disappeared, but he hadn't. Raymond stood near the baggage claim, watching Elijah approach. For once, he looked uncertain. Good flight, Raymond said after a beat. Elijah crossed his arms. Why'd you really get on my plane? Raymond sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Because I wanted to see if you were as good as they say. Elijah tilted his head. And? Raymond held his gaze. You're better. Elijah didn't expect the way those words hit him. For years, he had convinced himself that Raymond's approval didn't matter, that he had risen despite him, not because of him. But now, standing here, hearing it straight from the man who had spent his whole life doubting him, it did matter. Not for Raymond, for himself. Raymond shifted slightly. I wasn't always fair to you. Elijah smirked. That's one way to put it. Raymond nodded, then hesitated. But you didn't let it stop you. Elijah studied him. The man in front of him wasn't the same one who had dismissed him at the dinner table all those years ago. He exhaled. Number I didn't. For the first time, Raymond smiled. Just a little. They stood there for a moment, nothing left to say. Then Raymond gave him a small nod, almost as if in salute. Take care of yourself, Captain. Elijah watched as the man turned and walked away, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he had anything left to prove. The hum of activity inside Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was constant, a rhythmic flow of voices, footsteps, and the distant roar of jet engines. Elijah stood near the terminal windows, watching as a Boeing 737 taxied to the gate, the same kind of aircraft he had just landed, the same kind he would soon command, officially, permanently. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the next challenge. He was thinking about the journey that had brought him here. A quiet victory. The call from Delta Airlines headquarters had come just hours after landing. Captain Whitaker, your evaluation is complete. You're being promoted to full captain status. Congratulations. Elijah had let out a slow breath, absorbing the weight of the words. He had done it. Years of doubt, of fighting for a place in an industry that hadn't always welcomed men like him. It had all led to this moment. One last conversation. A soft chime from his phone pulled him from his thoughts. A text from Catherine. Raymond left this morning, didn't say much, just told me to tell you. He's proud. Elijah exhaled, rolling his shoulders. It wasn't an apology, but maybe it didn't need to be. Maybe Raymond had said everything he needed to on that flight, and maybe for the first time, Elijah didn't need his approval anymore. The first flight as captain. An hour later, Elijah walked onto the tarmac, stepping up to the aircraft he would be commanding, his first official flight as Captain Elijah Whitaker. Grayson stood by the jet bridge, arms crossed. So, Captain, you ready? Elijah smirked. Always. They walked into the cockpit together, and as he settled into his seat, Elijah felt something different this time. Not nerves, not doubt, just belonging. He flipped on the intercom. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard. And for the first time, those words felt exactly right. Some battles aren't fought in the air. They're fought within. Elijah Whitaker's journey wasn't just about proving he could fly. It was about proving that no one else could define his worth. In the end, he didn't just become a captain. he became the man he was always meant to be. So what about you? What's the voice in your life telling you that you're not good enough? And more importantly, are you ready to silence it? If this story moved you, hit subscribe and stay with us for more tales of resilience, justice, and the fight to rise above. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't just about winning, they're about becoming.